Although the real impact of Aegon Targaryen's prophecy on House of the Dragon has yet to be made clear, its introduction and the revelation that this is an idea taken directly from George R.R. Martin obviously opens up a multitude of fascinating possibilities. And among its greatest and most important impacts will likely be the way in which it influences every one of Rhaenyra's choices going forward. While Game of Thrones largely overlooked the relevance of prophecies and the effect that they can have on those that believe in them, their role as a plot device in George R.R. Martin's broader storylines is fascinating. Characters like Stannis, Cersei, and Daenerys constantly make decisions that are weighted by their own beliefs and interpretations and prophecy. And, while the content of these predictions has importance in its own right, oftentimes their real relevance simply boils down to how they influence the choices that are made by the characters themselves. These predictions typically act as a sort of mind worm for those that the prophecies are about or those who believe in them. If they want the prophecy to come true, then they must do the right things in order to make the prophecy come to pass. But it is assumed that it ultimately will come to pass. Or, if they're attempting to stop the predicted events from happening, they must do the right things in order to stop it. But it still might happen anyway. This understandably leads many characters down some strange and oftentimes completely wrong paths. And, as far as Rhaenyra and her role in Aegon's prophecy goes, the most analogous character arc to hers seems to obviously be the story of Stannis Baratheon. Stannis is essentially the picture-perfect example of what can happen to someone when they truly and wholeheartedly believe that they are destined to take the Iron Throne no matter what, as he is seemingly willing to do almost anything in order to make this happen, but he also believes that his actions, no matter how bizarre or horrific, will eventually lead to the outcome that he desires, and that they are all necessary for the safety and security of all Westeros. And obviously, he's wrong. And this of course doesn't necessarily mean that Rhaenyra is wrong about the part that she's meant to play in the greater storyline, but it feels incredibly relevant to her character arc going forward because, like Stannis, she has now been essentially infected by the same idea that drove Stannis to his complete destruction. The idea that she is the person destined to take the Iron Throne, and that her rule may be the key to the survival of all of Westeros has now been planted in her head. And that ideal will undoubtedly hold weight over everything that she decides going forward. The presentation of Rhaenyra is really interesting off the bat, because her perception of Targaryen godliness is actually far more rational than most Targaryens that came before or after her. It doesn't seem coincidental that the series established her understanding that Targaryens are essentially normal people who have power because of dragons, and not because of destiny or inherent superiority, when so many Targaryens seem to cleave to the exact opposite idea. But it also doesn't seem coincidental that Rhaenyra's declaration that the Targaryens are normies was immediately juxtaposed with Viserys' explanation about a Targaryen destined to save Westeros from the ice threat either. Again, although Rhaenyra and Stannis clearly have very little in common from a characterization perspective, it's not hard to pick up on the fact that even Stannis, someone who is portrayed as comically pragmatic and logical, became someone who was willing to slaughter his own family in service of his quest to the Iron Throne. It would certainly be interesting to see these two sides of Rhaenyra, the one who believes in her own normalcy and the one who is now aware of an unimaginably important destiny, in conflict. However, it also shouldn't come as a surprise, especially with the coming war, if Rhaenyra begins leaning into the idea that she truly is the chosen one, and that no one and nothing is more important than her becoming Queen of Westeros. The entire element of the prophecy being passed from king to heir is another wonderful hidden facet of this plot device, because it explains a lot of previously baffling choices on the part of both Viserys and Rhaenyra. Ultimately, Viserys' choice to maintain Rhaenyra as his heir has always been a bizarre one. Yes, the rules of Iron Throne succession aren't quite as established as the rest of Westeros, but almost everyone expected that if he ever had a true-born son, then that son would become king. Clearly, families like the Hightowers and Velaryons were not angling for their daughters to become the new queen with the expectation that their potential sons would not take the throne. And, while the rules of succession favoring men are unfair, it was also ultimately unfair for Viserys to enter into a new marriage without making it clear that he intended for Rhaenyra to become queen regardless of any future potential heirs that might come from his new union. Similarly, this explains why Rhaenyra was seemingly treated as an exception to the rule rather than a change to it. Although House of the Dragon seems to be presenting Rhaenyra's claim to the throne as some sort of vaguely feminist statement, Fire and Blood shows very little indication that Rhaenyra's confirmation as heir is just the first in a broader change where the eldest Targaryen child inherits the Iron Throne regardless of gender. It truly appears like the typical rules of succession aren't being altered, they're just not being applied to Rhaenyra for some reason. Again, this is a confusing plot point that makes a great deal more sense through the lens of a prophecy that only Viserys and Rhaenyra are aware of, and that Viserys and Rhaenyra have decided that she may be the subject of. But, even if that clarifies some strange aspects of the story for the reader themselves, it still leaves the in-universe characters baffled. Which again, creates a very interesting facet of the Dance of the Dragons. Because in a sense, the actions and behaviors of Alicent and the Greens are predictable by Rhaenyra and the Blacks because the motivation behind them is clear. And on the flip side, Rhaenyra's choices are more confusing and harder to predict because only she knows one of the most important reasons why she's doing what she does. That is of course not to say that Rhaenyra would have been in the wrong to try and stake her claim on the Iron Throne, even if she didn't believe that she were either the chosen one in Aegon's prophecy, or that her direct descendant was meant to be the chosen one. That is largely what makes the Dance of the Dragon such an interesting conflict. The dance is a fascinating war because essentially, both sides are right and wrong. This isn't like the conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters with a clear good guy and bad guy, as both Alicent and Rhaenyra have incredibly valid claims. Both would be unjustly screwed over if their opposition won, and ultimately both wind up doing unforgivably horrific things in service of their valid claims to the Iron Throne. According to most laws of Westerosi succession, Alicent's sons should take precedence over Rhaenyra's claim. And it's obvious that Alicent and Otto would have both consented to the match operating under this completely reasonable assumption. But this discordance essentially leaves Alicent and Rhaenyra in nearly identical situations. Viserys is a notoriously foolish king for this exact reason as well. Again, the addition of Aegon's prophecy actually makes his choices more comprehensible. But even if he believed in Rhaenyra's destiny, the fact that he kept that notion a secret and left Alicent and Rhaenyra in a scenario where they would almost certainly have to go to war with one another after his death is a fantastic example of interpretations of prophecy oftentimes superseding basic common sense. Instead of losing the forest for the trees, he seemingly lost the trees for the forest, as his belief in the inevitability of the bigger picture enabled him to bury his head in the sand about a very real and obvious succession issue. Leaving two valid claimants to any seat, especially one as powerful as the Iron Throne, is a horrific mistake that has repeatedly had massive impacts on all of Westeros. And it's hard to imagine a more evenly matched claim than the Greens and the Blacks. Alicent, of course, has tradition and the laws of most of the kingdoms on her side, and Rhaenyra has Viserys' specific approval as well as the vows of loyalty from the Lords of Westeros on hers. Essentially, these dueling claims put both of them in a position where it would almost be foolish to simply acquiesce to their rival claimants, but where they would also basically need to completely obliterate the competition in order to fully cement their victory. And presumably, they both know it. Alicent and her children cannot be truly safe as long as Rhaenyra lives, and Rhaenyra cannot be truly safe as long as Alicent and her children live. Therefore, the extremes that they go to throughout the Dance of the Dragons make some sense, as, although neither of them seems to start off as exceptionally cruel or brutal people, their only choices are to win or die. But if Aegon's prophecy truly was a factor here, then that adds another element to Rhaenyra's quest that wasn't there before. If she went to war with Alicent operating under the belief that she was literally destined to win no matter what, then that paints her actions and decisions in an entirely new light. One of the aspects of Alicent's journey that makes her more sympathetic is that she at least tried to ameliorate the chasm between her faction of the Targaryen family and Rhaenyra's. Viserys seems to interpret her actions as political ambition, but frankly, marrying the two most obviously rivaled claimants is common sense and the best course of action. Although it wasn't a perfect solution, it's still somewhat strange that Viserys and Rhaenyra are so blatantly opposed to it. But again, it could make more sense through the lens of Aegon's prophecy, and that once again shows the dangers of prophetic interpretation or misinterpretation. If Viserys had already interpreted the prophecy to mean that Rhaenyra must be his destined heir, then his unwillingness to consider his own sons as his heirs, despite the fact that he would be expected to, makes more sense. And if Rhaenyra's interpretation of the prophecy similarly does not include Alicent or any of her branch of the family, then again, her choice to go to war rather than uniting can at least make some sense. Although obviously in the long run, it doesn't. It's unclear how influential Aegon's prophecy is truly meant to be, both in House of the Dragon and the entire book franchise. It's entirely possible that it is little more than an Easter egg meant to connect House of the Dragon to Game of Thrones, and that the Dance of the Dragons was mostly about political machinations and nothing more. But it's difficult to ignore how much more comprehensible the decisions of characters like Viserys and Rhaenyra are if they believed that everything they were doing was a part of some grander destiny. It certainly doesn't make it logical, but it makes a lot of previously bizarre choices easier to understand. And it largely makes the Dance of the Dragons even more tragic. Although the importance of Aegon's prophecy will likely have the most obvious and immediate influence over the story that unfolds throughout House of the Dragon, the impact of these predictions on the entirety of House Targaryen makes their invasion and reign even more fascinating and bizarre, which is something I'll delve into in the next installment of Aegon's prophecy analysis. But what do you think? Is Rhaenyra's character arc largely driven by this secret prophecy? Or did she simply want the Iron Throne because her father named her his heir? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.